Welcome. I am Leo Lefebvre of Georgetown University and the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. I am delighted to welcome you to the second day of this two-day webinar on 500 years of Christianity and the global Filipinx. As is the custom for Christian Filipinos, we begin this gathering in prayer. The prayers will be offered in 5 of the more than 170 indigenous languages of the Philippines.
Akala ng kaloobang walang kasing ganda at ng mukhang lubos na kaaya-aya at ng paramdam na tunay na nakagiginhawa. Ginoo nga magbubuhat, Ginoo sa among mga katigulangan. Among nasinati ang imong mahigugmaong kaayo, diha sa hulagway ni Jesus imong anak, kansang sugilano nagdasig kanamo sa among timuha sa maangayon nga katilingban, diin ang tanan mahilakip. Kapamilataning kasal pantayanan apig kalumo kay kami, saupan mo kaming magsikap baning yato maginyang kalupaning kay kang kayarian. Sa diin may pagpaambitanay sa mga bahandi sang kalibutan, kag wala na sang may ginagutom. Sa diin may pagtahod sa mga magkalain-lain nga mga tribo kag kultura, kag ang paghidait nga napasad sa hustisya ang labaw nga manggagahom sa tanan. Dawaten mi daytoy babaen tinaga ni Jesus nga nasantuan nga apo tayo, kenti panangibabaet ni Santa Maria nga ina tayo. Amen.
Welcome to the conclusion of this two-day webinar on 500 years of Christianity and the global Filipinx, a collaborative effort of the Berkeley Center, De La Salle University in the Philippines, and BBI, the Australian Institute of Theological Education. I would like to thank Professor Christine Lledo-Gomez and Professor Agnes Brizal for their leadership in organizing these conversations that critically analyze the significance of this anniversary in the context of the migration of Filipinos around the world, including to the United States. Georgetown University and the Berkeley Center are very happy to host this webinar. Welcome to all. I would like to invite you to submit questions for discussion by using the Q&A function on your screen. Please state the country that you are coming from and the speaker to whom you are addressing the question. Our chair for today's session will be Dr. Cristina Lledo-Gomez from BBI, the Australian Institute of Theological Education in Sydney, Australia. Dr. Lledo-Gomez is a Catholic systematic theologian who has presented and published widely in the areas of ecclesiology, maternal feminist theology, domestic violence, migration, sexual abuse in the church, and eco-theology. In the chat box, you will find a list of her main publications, awards, and leadership roles as one of the most distinguished Asian Catholic theologians in Australia. I now am happy to invite Dr. Lledo-Gomez to lead our discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Lefebvre, for your most very kind introduction, and to the Berkeley Center, Georgetown University, for generously hosting our event over these 2 days. Before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal lands and people on which we are gathering from all over the world, particularly the Philippines, Australia, and the USA. Here in Australia, we have a tradition of respecting and honoring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present, and future. I particularly acknowledge the Guringai and Darug peoples, who are the original custodians of the land I am speaking from. As a Filipina, I also wish to acknowledge our Philippine Indigenous, including those on this webinar. I acknowledge their stories, traditions, and living cultures, and commit to building a brighter future together. If you know the name of the Indigenous people on whose lands you stand today, please feel free to write that in the chat box. Magandang umaga, magandang hapon, o magandang gabi. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to the second day of this two-day webinar. Yesterday, our speakers enlightened us with the context of the entry of Christianity into the Philippines. Dr. Brazal showed us what it meant to engage in post-colonial criticism, and then proceeded to highlight historical moments that set the tone for how Christianity was to unfold in the Philippines. Dr. Angeles then enabled us to understand the roots of tense Christian-Muslim relations in the Philippines. She called us to work towards embracing diversity and better dialogue between Christians and Muslims. In a similar light, Dr. Ibita called us to embrace our Jewish Filipinos, pointing out that the Jews, or Judios, have been othered by Christian missionaries. Upon their character was assigned anything that was to be hated or feared, which is a most unjust and unchrist-like thing to do. Meanwhile, Dr. Pilario showed us the double truth of the mission of the Spanish conquistadores in the Philippines. He explained that in Christian theological terms, we can understand this mission as the presence of grace despite brokenness and sinfulness. This reminded me of one of Karl Rahner's sayings on grace, that where sin abounds, grace abounds even more. Finally, Dr. Alejos called us to reflect on the complexity of apologies. Quoting a bishop, he pointed out that Christians should not feel they must apologize for sharing the gospel, the good news, with the indigenous peoples. Instead, what they should apologize for is the way in which this was done, which is not what Jesus would have done. Our program for today begins with my short talk on living the legacy of being Christian today as a Filipina migrant. We will then hear from Dr. Lenny Strobel, Reverend Dr. Ferdinand Ano, Reverend Dr. Revelacion Belunta, and Dr. Antonio Sison, who will explore the concepts of reappropriation, resistance, and decolonization of the Philippine Christian faith. Dr. Sison will present via recording as he was called to other duties at the last minute. The final 20 or so minutes are dedicated to answering your questions. I will be providing some closing remarks and then asking you to give feedback through our online evaluation form. On the Philippine Catholic Bishops' Conference website, 500yoc.com, Bishop Pablo Virgilio David wrote an essay entitled, "Why Celebrate 500 Years of Christianity in the Philippines? Was not Christianity a mere tool for colonial rule?" In it, he affirmed Christianity's positive legacy upon the Filipino peoples, even if it was the very means by which Spanish conquistadores sought to subjugate them. His essay ended with an insistence that what was being celebrated was not colonial rule, but the Christian readily received by the Filipino people. As a Filipina living in Australia for over 3 decades, having spent my formative years in the Philippines and growing up with Filipino parents here in Australia, I have mixed feelings about celebrating 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines. Whilst I am grateful that Bishop Virgilio suggested there was a dark side to the Christianization of the Philippines, and I acknowledge the enormous gift Christianity brought to my kababayans, my fellow Filipinas and Filipinos, I give to myself as a migrant and a Catholic theologian, I do not readily jump to the celebration of this event, knowing that white Christian colonial and patriarchal mentality was introduced into our culture, specifically suspicion of women spiritual leaders, of non-Christians, particularly Muslims and Jews, as we heard yesterday, and suspicion of indigenous beliefs and practices. And yet, on this last point, indigenous beliefs and practices have never really died, but simply appropriated. We see this in the Babaylans who adapted by calling themselves faith healers, and my own devoutly Christian aunts and uncles who would happily place food under the tree for the spirits dwelling there, and would consult an abulario, a shaman, to heal their sick child after Western medicine has failed them. On the dismantled spiritual women leaders, Filipino theologians such as Cristina Astorga, Mary John Mananzan, and Agnes Brazal are returning to their stories to resist the disempowerment that comes with a patriarchal and misogynist version of Christianity that seems to persist in existence today. I am also deeply concerned with the colonial message of the Filipino native as inferior, especially the idea of white normativity. This ideal was ingrained by the Spanish colonizers, reinforced by the American invaders, and has been perpetuated from generation to generation through unquestioned practices, such as mothers massaging their daughters' noses every night so that they can become more European. To this day, there are Filipina migrant mothers who continue to do that because they have been taught it is a way of caring for their daughters. Dr. Strobel, who will be our first speaker, will talk more about this phenomenon as colonial mentality. But to explain briefly, colonial mentality among Filipinos manifests in the following ways: denigration of the Filipino self, Filipino culture or body, discrimination against less Americanized or less white Filipinos, and tolerating historical and contemporary oppression. Recent psychological studies show around 30% of Filipino Americans and Filipino Australians experience colonial mentality. But I believe these are conservative numbers, given they count only those who present at psychological or counseling practices. There are others who claim they do not have colonial mentality, and yet inwardly believe being white is better. The Philippine inferiority complex can appear in an overemphasis of their unworthiness, communicated through their misunderstandings of the concept of sin paired with a merciful God, without the balancing message of a God who takes utter delight in them, in their individualities, quirks, and imperfections. Yet the opening passages of Genesis 1 tells us otherwise. After each of God's creation, God saw they were good. Through repetition, the Genesis writer or writers sought to communicate that God saw all of God's creation as good. I've also said Christianity has been a gift to Filipinos and Filipinas. We know this already from the nuns, brothers, and priests who are motivated by their Christian faith to encourage the Filipino people to stand up for their dignity. People such as Sister Mary John Mananzan, who remains involved in activism and risks her own life as she seeks to live out that fundamental Christian social principle of human dignity and also preferential option for the poor. Christianity has also been a gift to Filipina and Filipino migrants, settling in a new place without your old networks, in a different culture, even in a different language. Australian English can be very difficult to understand when you are trained in American English in the Philippines. The Christian church can be that place of familiarity, even that instant family or support network in an otherwise scary, unfamiliar world. At the same time, Christian churches can be another colonial space to navigate, to adjust oneself rather than feeling one can be oneself. When migrants settle, especially into regional areas of Western countries, noting that anti-white racial laws were only abolished a few decades ago, white normativity remains in their systems and structures. Churches can claim to embrace multiculturalism, but often it is approached superficially. For example, churches might decide on World Day for Migrants and Refugees, held every last Sunday of September, to hold a multicultural day, inviting congregations to dress in their national costume, share their food, songs, and dance with the congregation. I think this is a wonderful celebration of country and culture, but it must go beyond this and seek to address real issues of cultural misunderstandings and of multiple difficulties migrants face in settling into a new country, especially if they are also dealing with domestic violence. For a while here in Australia, Filipinas were known as mail order brides and experienced the highest number of domestic violence as a race. Their churches were either spaces of escape from violence or were completely unaware of the terror these Filipina brides faced. The policy in Australia, in fact, changed so that Australian men could stop marrying many Filipino women, often justifying their actions as rescuing Filipinas from their poverty. There are multicultural chaplains to attend to the different migrant populations, but this is compartmentalizing what should be addressed by the whole congregation, and that is the remaining dominant systems and structures that normalize white normativity. Pope Francis, in his 2017 message on World Day of Refugees and Migrants, actually encouraged people to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate migrants into their new home. And these are concrete actions that we can already take today, rather than reflect on them as just beautiful messages from the Vatican. At the same time, migrants are not simply people to whom Western churches must minister to. They give back plenty to their churches. In fact, the Vietnamese American theologian Peter Phan claims that many churches would not exist today if not for migrants, particularly when those churches have a large population of Filipinos, Indians, and people from non-Western countries. He even repurposed that old adage, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, outside the church there is no salvation, to restate extra migrationem nulla salus, outside of migration there is no salvation. Indeed, indigenous systems, ways of not being white, used to be seen as inferior and demonized because of the white Christian colonizer. The talks yesterday reminded us of this mindset. Today, especially after the Black Lives movements in America and all over the world, non-white persons are reclaiming their heritage and propping them up as having equal worth to white British, American, or European ways of knowing and being, hermeneutics, and epistemology. This 500 years anniversary of Christianity in the Philippines is the right moment for Filipinos and Filipinas all over the world to realize the broader perspective and implications of that violent entry. It is the time to affirm the ways in which Filipinos and Filipinas have adapted, leading to their persistence in survival amidst suffering and hurdles, and to see the ways in which Christian and indigenous beliefs and practices have coexisted as valid forms of religiosity, which are not aberrant or inferior, but an example of the building of God's reign on earth. It is time too for Filipinos and Filipinas to disrupt the pattern of passing on colonial trauma introduced by the Christian colonizers. We can do this by re-examining our unquestioned practices and reimagining our theological imaginations, as Dr. Alejo suggested to us yesterday. Dr. Strobel, Dr. Sison, Reverend Ano, and Reverend Volunta will hopefully help us to forge a Filipino Christian theology that is unapologetically both Christian and Filipino-Filipina. I'm so excited that you are here to hear their amazing work. I will now turn to Dr. Strobel to present her talk. Well, actually, I'll introduce you first, Dr. Strobel. Strobel is Professor Emerita in American Multicultural Studies at Sonoma State University. She is one of the founding elders of the Center for Babaylan Studies. The rest of her bio can be found in the chat box. Her talk today is on decolonizing the diaspora through the Center for Babaylan Studies. Welcome, Dr. Strobel.
Thank you so much, Christina. Maya pagat panapon po kaya kayungan. My name is Elenita Fe Luna Mendoza Strobel. I am Kapampangan from the Philippines. I left my homeland in 1982 and settled on Wapo, Southern Pomo, and Coast Miwok lands. It took almost 3 decades to understand what settler colonialism and native genocide have done to the land and the peoples of the lands I live on. With this realization, I acknowledge my own entanglement with this history and affirm my commitment to build relationships with the local indigenous communities so that, with their permission, I may nurture and feed an indigenous future with them. I begin with this land acknowledgement because colonialism is all about the land. Dispossession of the land led to the dispossession of our mind and bodies, our languages, our indigenous wisdom, knowledge and practices, and especially our indigenous spirituality. This is what the violence of colonization has done to us as a people. National artist for literature N.V.M. Gonzalez said, "We developed a type of cultural Alzheimer's disease." Filipino theologian Melba Magay said, "We were culturally circumcised." Other scholars said we developed a split self, and as a society, there is now a great cultural divide between the masses and the educated elites. Vicente Rafael writes of white love, of Filipinos falling in love with their colonizers. Our neo-colonial educational system didn't teach us to understand how colonialism works, how the modern paradigms of development and progress have tricked us into submission and buying into the beliefs that the West, represented by the Holy Trinity of the IMF, the World Bank, and WTO, would solve the problems of poverty, inequity, inequality, and injustice. We were taught instead to internalize what President McKinley said about colonizing us, that we are a people who needed to be uplifted and Christianized. Fast forward to the 21st century. Millions of us have left our homeland in search of jobs to feed our families and to better our lives. We acquired skills to fit into the global demand for caregiving, nursing, domestic work, construction, entertainment, etc. Rachel Pereñas, a Filipino-American sociologist, calls us the servants of globalization. By the time I arrived in the US in 1983, the condition among Filipinos in California was marked by the stark differences between the post-1965 Filipino immigrants and the earlier Manong generation. Most of them were single male workers from rural areas in the Philippines. The newly arrived immigrants were educated, English-speaking, and many came from the middle class and urban centers. The colonial mentality of new immigrants made them assimilate, discouraged their children from keeping their native languages, and led them to deny their ethnic roots and identities. As a newly arrived immigrant, I came to realize that my neo-colonial education made me identify with the US, but the US did not identify with me. Thus began my journey of decolonization. I returned to school and began to unpack and sought to undo the epistemic, psychic, and ontological violence of colonialism in my life. Amidst this upheaval, I found the work of Virgilio Enriquez, the father of Filipino indigenous psychology. His framework and his articulation of Filipino indigenous core values, kapwa, pakikiramdam, kagandahang loob, dangal, paninindigan, stirred up something deep in my soul. I listened to this stirring and followed the trail that was set before me. I researched cultural identity formation and then offered a framework and process of decolonization for post-1965 Filipino Americans. I wrote, published, and started to teach. And soon my book, Coming Full Circle, was picked up as a textbook by educators, culture bearers, immigrants, mental health workers, and other diasporic Filipinos who resonated with the framework of decolonization that I proposed. This serves as online communities began to form to discuss the book and later to discuss the history of the Babaylan tradition. Dr. Brasal also mentioned this Babaylan history yesterday. By the time the Center of Babaylan Studies was created in 2009, the decolonization path was already well paved by our ancestors, by our indigenous kapwa, by Babaylans, Katipuneros, peasant revolutionaries, our grandmothers and grandfathers, our aunties and uncles. But their stories were often not told or barely included in the neo-colonial American patterned educational system. In 2005, at the Filipino Women's Network Conference in New York University, Sister Mary Jan Manansan, our keynote speaker, challenged us to organize an international Babaylan conference. Between 2005 and 2009, I spent summers in the Philippines attending Babaylan conferences and Kapwa conferences. And on 2 Fulbright Hays grants, I took teachers to Mindanao and immersed ourselves in K-12 schools, indigenous communities, and schools of living tradition. We were hosted by Father Alejo. In 2010, the first Babaylan conference was held at my institution. We expected that maybe 100 people would show up. On the day of the conference, 250 people showed up. We presented keynote talks on Kapwa psychology, indigenous healing arts, indigenous oral traditions, culture-bearing practices, and ritual and ceremony provided platforms for diasporic Filipinos who practice silot, traditional tattooing, kulintang music, Maranao dances, etc. Apo Reina Yolanda, a Babaylan from Cagayan, and Celia Rizal, and her entourage of 4 women, came and did ritual and ceremony with us. In 2011, we organized a symposium and retreat on decolonization as a sacred path with Felipe de Leon Jr., then Commissioner of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. This was an invitation-only retreat for participants from the first conference so that we might deepen our knowledge and build a core of leadership for the Center of Babaylan Studies. In 2008 and 2012, Filipinos from Canada and the US attended the Kapwa conferences at UP Iloilo and UP Baguio, organized by Heritage and Arts Academies of the Philippines, led by Catherine de Guia and Kidlat Tahimik. At these conferences, we started to build relationships with indigenous communities, elders, and youth. Many diasporic folks from the US and Canada have been maintaining this connection since then through the Center for Babaylan Studies or through their own initiatives. Storytelling is central to the indigenous tradition. In 2013, the second Babaylan conference focused on the power of mythic stories, and we invited indigenous filmmakers Kidlat Tahimik and Kanakan Balintagos, along with the tribal chairman of the Federated Indians of Grayton Rancheria, Greg Ceres, who is also Filipino and teller of the creation stories of the Pomo and Coast Miwok peoples, the land on which the conference was held. Our vision was to strengthen the foundation of Filipino indigenous knowledge, systems, and practices in the diaspora. Kapwa psychology, mythic stories, dream work, rituals, and ceremony continued to shape our vision. And then we realized that we really needed to address the relationship between indigenous spirituality and Christianity. And in 2015, we held a symposium retreat in Ohio with Father Albert Alejo as our keynote speaker. We also supported the building of a traditional Ifugao healing hut led by Ifugao Mumbaki Mamerto Tindongan. This Ifugao hut has since moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and is on the land under the indigenously informed stewardship of Carol Gamiao Wallace. In 2016, the Babaylan Conference was hosted by Katara Society in the unceded Coast Salish territory in British Columbia. At this conference, we engaged with Native communities for the first time as we realized the importance of revitalizing indigenous traditions on lands where diasporic Filipinos are settlers. We were welcomed and hosted by the chief of the Squamish peoples. This is the first time that CFBS raised the question of what it means to identify not as immigrants, but as settlers. Looking at settler colonialism provided a different lens that felt more resonant with our decolonization practices. In 2019, the fourth Babaylan Conference focused on the conundrums of doing indigenous work in fractured settings. We asked ourselves how we might learn from the land and unlearn empire. How do we reclaim our indigenous mind? How can we learn to dwell in place? How can we develop allyship and kinship with our indigenous Kapwa on Turtle Island? Kapwa Collective, our local partners on the ground, co-hosted the conference with us in the Wata Kanien Kehaka territory, also known as Toronto. In our decade-long engagement, we sowed the seeds of decolonization and later our decolonial practices. We learned how to embody kapwa. We are reconnecting with our ancestors and ancestral wisdom. We are learning how to dwell in place. Greg Seres and other indigenous scholars say that we can become indigenous to a place if we learn the history of the lands and the peoples where we have settled, when we learn to live in mutual respect with all the beings that live with the land. For me, as a settler, this has meant learning about the history of Native genocide in California and in the US, and how this genocide connects to the colonization of my homeland. Our publications, Coming for Circle, Babaylan, Filipinos, and the Call of the Indigenous, Back from the Crocodile's Belly, Between the Homeland and the Diaspora, resonate with many readers to this day. Coming Full Circle is a textbook in many ethnic studies courses. The Babaylan book brings together culture-bearing and indigenous storytellers from the homeland and the US. The Crocodile book, co-edited with my sister Lily Mendoza, followed up with a focus on the importance of the indigenous paradigm in speaking back to the colonizing logic of modernity. Lily Mendoza's book, Between the Homeland and the Diaspora, historicizes and bridges the discourses on Filipino identity in these two places. Today, there is a visible decolonization movement in the diaspora. The use of social media by second and third generation Filipino Americans and Filipino Canadians is fueling the movement. Indigenous practices like batok, baybayin, laga weaving, kulintang, kali, and martial arts, plant medicine, hilot, and other indigenous inspired healing practices are flourishing. It remains to be seen whether the related social and economic entrepreneurship emerging from this cultural resurgence in the diaspora is going to be transformative in the sense of connection, engagement, and support for indigenous concerns and communities in the homeland. I am aware that it is not enough for young people in the diaspora to be interested in indigenous forms and practices, although this is usually an entry point as they begin to reconnect with their Filipino heritage. Sometimes this reconnection is critiqued as nostalgic and romantic, even appropriative and extractive, and such critiques are necessary in order to deepen and sharpen our discernment as we decolonize and re-indigenize. This is what I call the indigenous turn in our decolonization movement in the diaspora. These practices signal a movement that points to our native brilliance and intelligence. Today, social media facilitates conversations between homeland and diasporic communities. They discuss pre-colonial and indigenous beliefs. There's a growing interest in mythic storytelling and revitalization of languages. Many are using podcasts and webinars to deepen connections and to build virtual communities. But it is on the ground, in local and place-based practices of dwelling and community building where kapwa and ginhawa thrives. CFBS has been mindfully working to model sustainable relationships with indigenous communities in the Philippines. For decades, we've nurtured our connection to the Heritage and Arts Academies of the Philippines, to the Tao Foundation, to Balay Patawili of the Panay Bukidnon, with the Lasiway or Tiboli weavers of Lake Cebu and others. What we need at this time is to document our learnings in these collaborations and develop an archive that can be passed on to the younger generation. In closing, the decolonization movement in the diaspora is located in the cracks of a civilization that is beginning to crumble under the weight of its own worldview that desacralized the earth. We are struggling to make sense of the 5 centuries of Christianization and how this is complicit in the perpetuation of white supremacy and racism. We are recovering our indigenous spirituality that is embedded in our cultural DNA. This is spirituality that comes alive as we root ourselves in lands that were stolen by empire and where the history of genocide haunts us. we are trying to remember the indigenous roots of the Christian tradition itself. I see a younger generation of diasporic Filipinos reaching out for a sense of belonging to a homeland where the memories of the homeland are only remembered in fragments and glimpses of stories and practices. They are also wanting to learn how to be indigenous to the places where they have settled on Turtle Island. We join a global movement of spiritual refugees seeking sanctuary, learning what it means to build an indigenous future. Father Albert Alejo once told me, "Lenny, do not worry about indigenous peoples disappearing. All it takes is for one of them to have a dream and everything becomes alive again." We are still dreaming.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strobel, for sharing with us the difficult story of your own decolonization process, but also the hopeful work that you do in helping others to decolonize, engaging as well with Indigenous peoples, and grappling with things such as settler colonialism and Kapwa psychology. Thank you so much. I now turn to Dr. Reverend Ferdinand Arnold, who is the president of the Union Christian College La Union and of STEP, Samahan ng Teologikal na Edukasyon ng Pilipinas, an association of theological schools in the Philippines. He is an indigenous pastor of the United Church of Christ in the Philippines and taught theology and worship at the Union Theological Seminary, Philippines. You will find the rest of his bio in the chat box. Today, he will be speaking on the Igolots Pudong and the Liturgia of the Post-Human Commune. Welcome, Dr. Ano.
Yamanak Apo Christina. Now, is there a connection between the planting of Magellan's Cross and Philippine Christianity's silence about the destruction of our mountains and rainforests? Or have we reached that point where we need to uproot the cross and plant the pudong of the Igorots instead? A blessed day to everyone. I'm glad to be part of this conversation. I belong to that national community formed in Angaki by the great Abra River once upon a time, the Bago Igorots of the southwestern fringes of the Cordillera region. My presentation would dwell on the significance of the pudong to the formation of an ecumenical interfaith spirituality of resistance vis-a-vis the continuing reality of development aggression in the Philippines and in particular the Cordilleras. The post-human in critical theory is mainly understood in relation to the technopolis and artificial intelligence. Here I use the idea of the post-human commune more in the indigenous ecological sense and in relation to the politics of negating the anthropocentrism of our eschatological imagination. In April 2021, President Duterte lifted the 9-year-old ban on new mining deals. And 2 months ago, on last December 20 and 22, he included the lifting of the ban on open pit mining. The president has also revived the Marcos era Chico River Basin Development Project and launched the Ginod 1 and 2 in Apayao in the northern part of the region. These are all happening while a global pandemic rages on. This is the immediate context of my resurfacing the Pudong Rite of the Igolotes of Gran Cordillera and what it may say about Christianity's liturgical witnessing in the contemporary world. The pudong is the bundle of breadsticks you can see from behind me. Bundle of breadsticks with knotted ends that most of us in the mountain region install in places where we gather for a ritual event. The installation could also be at this entrance and walkways to the village. Now, what does it mean when an Igorot plants the pudong on the ground? Is the ritual unconnected to the clear and present danger facing our planet? Whenever the Igorots gather as a community, they make it a point to plant or install a pudong prominently at the vicinity of the gathering place at the entrance of the village for people to take notice. On occasions like our rest days, this comes with the announcement of the commencement of our Sabbath. The planting of the pudong is accompanied by prayers bidding everyone, both seen and unseen, to look after the houses, gardens, sweden farms, livestock, properties, and all that the villagers live for the gathering. The pudong gives the assurance that all dwellings are under divine protection and that no property will be violated throughout the duration of the gathering. Any infringement on those under the watch of Kavunyan, one of the Igorot's names for divinity, are to suffer the wrath of the spirits. The ritual also calls on people and every living being to observe a solemn pose from whatever activity or work they are doing. When the pudong is standing, the whole earth and all of life rest. Now, firstly, when we plant the pudong, we declare the land and all that dwell therein as holy. When we declare things as holy, we stand in awe of them. We are duty-bound to be reverential about them. We preserve them in their pristine form as much as possible. We preserve and protect them. We live in harmony with them, celebrate their power, and feast around their good graces and blessings, while at the same time seeking restitution and balance whenever we offend them. When colonial Christianity came and declared that Kavunyan is not in charge anymore, and that the one true God is the only one who is holy and who owns everything, and is known only via Christianity, everything was disenchanted and desacralized. The land effectively became a mere resource for humanity to exploit for the latter's flourishing. To put it more succinctly, Christianity's radical monotheism contributed to the eventual rape of Gran Cordillera. Secondly, when we plant the pudong, we call on people to be a community again. The pudong signals a movement from separation to communion. When knotted and stuck on the ground, the pudong calls on the people to come together as one nation, isin pangili, a community where social differentiation is set aside. The Igorots believe that the pudong are a gateway through which ancestral spirits come by to commune with the living. The pudong thus further pushes the expanse of people's communal self-understanding. In this ritual, all creatures are reminded of their sharing the land and this life with ancestral spirits, and that the living must relate with them in filial reverence. Under the guise of Christianization, the colonial government and big business has gone into cultural re-engineering programs designed to destroy the community's resistance. And this included Christian religious education, spiritual formation, and allied programs aimed at erasing the Igorot's indigenous memory and identity. These cultural Trojan horses were aimed at disorienting people away from their indigeneity and spirituality towards submission to their new colonial identity and way of life. At present, big business is putting up cultural and political barriers to foil various community attempts to come together in a pan-Cordilleran commune. Practiced almost everywhere in the mountain region, the planting of the pudong may be saying that the kaigurutan is one, and that our security lies not in those whose agenda is to sever our culto-spiritual relationship with the earth, but in the religious and proper observance of the rites of radical connectivity with the earth. Thirdly, when we plant the pudong, we re-sacralize the profaned earth. To the Igorot, the land is inherently sacred, and ritual performances like the pudong are occasions for the public affirmation of this reality. The act of planting the pudong reclaims and celebrates the reality of a cultic relationship between the earth and her tillers, a relationship of mutual care, a mutuality designed to sustain life, and insofar as the local priests and shamans are concerned, a relationship designed in the mind of divinity. The current neoliberal order heavily relies on the wanton exploitation of the earth and its resources. It is thus necessary for big corporations, bureaucrats, and their cultural partisans to manufacture people's consent. by all means, including fascist repression and militarization. Cultural agencies, including religious groups, are being co-opted in this social project of manufacturing consent and softening people's resistance. Christian revivalism, with its American frontier, "This world is not my home" gospel, has been negating and disenchanting the non-human environment, while at the same time, with the stroke of genius, tapping into indigenous people's primal spirituality to sell itself as a religious alternative. In this light, the Pudong ritual declares as living and pulsating the faith affirmation that the earth is sacred and that it is Kawinyan's and the spirits, not simply anyone's property to trespass and exploit as one pleases. The mountains, to use Hebraic scriptural language, are where the bushes burn. They reveal the face of divinity, and they call for sandals to be taken off. Similarly, the Pudong cries out, "Stay off the sacred." And lastly, the Pudong ritual calls for a jubilee for the earth and all that dwells therein. In Igorot cosmology, the land is a living, creative organism that shares the biological characteristics of other living creatures. If the human, the water buffalo, and other work animals tire, so does the land. The earth needs rest, and so do its tillers. Even the gods and spirits need rest. In other words, the Pudong calls for the relief of the land and all that dwell therein. And in the case of Northern Kankanais or the Ifuntoks Tengao or the Tingians Ubaya, the planting of the Pudong signals the beginning of Sabbath for everyone and every creature. The call to rest is so thorough that no one is allowed entry to or exit from the village throughout the duration of the Tengao. This is kultus, or mutual care, at its highest symbolic form. The Igorot's reason for being takes its cues from the people's kultus. The Tengao calls for the resting of the land. It is incumbent upon the tiller to ensure that the land is at rest. This is the Igorot's part in its cultic relationship with the land. The Pudong serves to remind the Igorot tillers of their part in this covenant. The whole Grand Cordillera chain of mountains is already partitioned by applications from multinational corporations involved in large-scale mining, logging, hydroelectric, coal, and geothermal, pharmaceutical, and other extractive industries. The Mining Act of 1995 further intensified development aggression, leaving the mountains and their tillers without a real experience of rest. One story among the Amburayan Kankanais, otherwise known as Bago Igorots, says that the continuous denuding of their mountains made the gods and spirits flee, leaving their balding mountains devoid of divine presence. As a result, the lands and communities living under the shadows of these mountains have been left unprotected by the gods and spirits. This state of abandonment effectively sentenced our sacrificial altars, the papatayans, to their death. When the gods and the spirits have flown, the altars lay idle and the religion and culture surrounding them die. The Pudong rite is to the Igolyote as potent as the missionary conquistador's ritual of cross planting. If the second meant the subjugation of the land and its people, the first seeks to reaffirm the freedom of the land, water, sky, and people. The Pudong calls on the villages to touch the ground more intentionally and know that the earth is sacred. Long uprooted from our Adamic selves, we need to literally touch the ground, remove our shoes and sandals, and see God again in the burning bush. Finally, I propose that our reflections during this continuing commemoration of the 500th year of Christianity in the Philippines should include the following. 1, Christianization's contribution to the marginalization of indigenous peoples, their spiritualities, and their ways of living. Second, Christianity's contribution to the desecration and plunder of indigenous peoples' lands. Third, how can Christianization or Christianity be a companion to indigenous peoples in their continuing struggle for national identity, self-determination, and in their struggle as guardians of the country's last frontiers. And lastly, what is there in the Pudong that can inform us in our continuing decolonization and contextualization of our liturgia as faith communities? Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat.
Salamat po, Reverend Ano. That was such a vivid image to give to us, the planting of the Magellan Cross as such a contrast from the planting of the Pudong, and from when the sacredness of the Pudong was put onto this one God only, that's when we got the desecration of lands and the desecration of the holiness of even the indigenous peoples. And so we have a lot of work to do, as you've outlined, and thank you so much for giving us this challenge, and for continuing to work with us on this difficult work of dialogue between Christians and the indigenous peoples.
Thank you.
I now turn to Dr. Reverend Revelacion Enriquez Velunta, who is Associate Professor of New Testament and Cultural Studies at Union Theological Seminary, Philippines. He is the author of Reading the Parables of Jesus in a Jeepney. You will find the rest of his bio in the chat box. He will be speaking on Jeepney hermeneutics, reading the Bible as Canaanites. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Reverend Revelacion Velunta.
Magandang umaga po, magandang hapon, magandang good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Laura Donaldson asks, what civilization invented the most brutal system of conquest and exploitation the world has ever known? Christian. Who made slavery the basis for capitalist expansion? Christians. What religion has been the most responsible for the genocide of Aboriginal peoples? Christianity. The Christian Church has a much more substantial record of pure evil than any final doom. Robert Allen Warrior argues that the liberationist picture of Yahweh is incomplete. In the conquest narratives, Yahweh the liberator becomes Yahweh the conqueror. Warrior points out that all these characters in Exodus and conquest narratives for Native Americans to identify with are the Canaanites, the people who already lived in the promised land. Canaanites should be the center of theological reflection and political action. They are the last remaining ignored voice in the text, except perhaps for the land itself. The Bible expresses little concern for the indigents and their rights as human beings and as nations. Especially ignored are the passages where Yahweh tells the Israelites mercilessly annihilate the indigenous population. Oppressive narratives of conquest, anti-Semitism, sexism, heterosexism, imperialism, monotheism, racism, all forms of dehumanization remain in the canonized text. Imperialism is primarily a textual project. The connection of Western Christianity to imperialism in Asia requires no special pleading. The Bible remains imperialism's most effective text in Asia. Biblical interpretation in many Asian countries continues to privilege the centers of power within, behind, and in front of the text. The Bible remains the primary source of imperial software. According to Quokwilan, less than 1% of the 16.67% representing white men write over 90% of what the world reads. How does one do a decolonizing reading of an imperializing text? How does one read the Bible without perpetuating the self-serving paradigm of constructing one group, one race, one place, one God, or one people as superior to another? How do most Asian Christians, as modern-day Canaanites, overcome the alienation we feel as we try to relate the biblical world, colonial Christianity, and our own reality? How does one do a Canaanite reading of the text? I suggest Jeepney hermeneutics. Jeepney hermeneutics begins with one's view of the Bible. Traditional roles of scripture are problematic when they involve submission to the text. Many Asian biblical interpreters, mimicking many of the Western teachers, begin with a theological affirmation, explicit or not, that the Bible is God's word, and that it offers access to the one true God as a complete and final revelation of that one true God, Jesus Christ. Jeepney hermeneutics presupposes that the Bible is a U.S. military army jeep, a sword, an imperializing text, a dangerous text as demonstrated throughout history by the many horrendous crimes committed in its name, especially among peoples and nations constructed as Canaanites. These include Native Americans, Palestinians, and yes, Filipinos. This is the U.S. military jeep, considered as America's greatest contribution to the history of modern warfare. The first 1,000 years of Christianity was 1 millennium of war and destruction in the name of Jesus Christ. And those civilizing missions have not stopped. Even today, the most oppressive and dehumanizing societies are led by Christian leaders who have no qualms maiming and destroying those who are one of them. And two of these are regular occupants of the White House and Malacanang Palace. Musa Dewey asks, does the biblical text offer an explicit stance for or against imperialism? Does the narrative encourage travel to distant and inhabited lands, and how does it justify such travel? How does the narrative present those who are different from the main characters? Is there dialogue and liberating interdependence between the main characters and others? Or is there condemnation and replacement of all that is foreign and other? Is the celebration of difference authentic or mere tokenism? Does the text present relationships of subordination and domination? And now, how does it construct women, children, slaves, and Canaanites? The US Army back in 1940 required an all-terrain reconnaissance go-anywhere vehicle that seated 3 and had a mount for a 30 caliber machine gun. Filipinos have transformed this military vehicle into a minibus that can accommodate 20 people or more, including animals. There are those who look at a jeepney and call it a Frankenstein's monster, while there are others who see it as a Filipino home on wheels, complete with an altar. The military jeep was, and still is, an imperializing text. A jeepney is a resistant reading of a jeep. Today with EDCA, jeeps roam the Philippines anew. And this is how you beat swords into plowshares. And there are other examples. The World Peace Bell in Korea is made from melted cartridges from the Korean War. And many Apache flutes come from Pilgrim's musket rifle barrels. These Orthodox church bells in Ethiopia were made from Soviet-made tanks. Of course, this electric guitar started from an AK-47. And this Israeli Defense Force tear gas canisters have been transformed into Palestinian flower pots in honor of those who have died. Jeepney hermeneutics celebrates the fact that the first thing that the Filipino masses did in the transformation of the military jeep was to rid it of the machine gun and its mount. Next, we transformed the backbone of Mar into a public utility vehicle. Third, we transformed the public utility vehicle into a Filipino home on wheels that is open to anyone and everyone, even those without money for fare. The 70% ride jeepneys in the Philippines. Matthew, commentators always say, 2 empires meet, Jesus and the centurion, and curiously enough, they are pleased with one another. The Gospel of Matthew celebrates imperial agents, especially the centurion in chapter 8. To read Matthew inside the jeepney is to remove our gaze from the centurion And yes, even Jesus, who eventually mimics the centurion, break down the back wall and focus on someone else. I suggest focusing our attention on the child servant, the Pais, in 8:5-13. Let us privilege the Pais, or the Canaanite woman, the little bitch, the children, and the margins in Matthew. The Pais, whether translated son, daughter, girl, boy, servant, slave, or sex slave, is a child, 12 years old. She serves to remind flesh and blood readers what the reality of empire in varying forms and degrees is experienced by children and by those who are treated as children. We don't even get to hear the cries of the children who are massacred in 2:18, only their mother's cries. Children are the primary victims of Matthew's culture of silence. Filipinos are always constructed as children. Rosario Baluyot was a 12-year-old sexually exploited child in Olongapo City. A Swiss doctor who came as a tourist to the Philippines used her and inserted a vibrator into her vagina. The vibrator broke in half, and one half remained inside her. After some weeks, she began to have stomach pains. The pain was too great. She could not walk. When she was examined, a rusting object was found inside her. It was there for 7 months. Rosario died from infection. Who pais mo? The slave who is mine, property. That child's body is under somebody else's control. Father, owner, or in Rosario's case, pedophile. The pais cannot speak or seek her own healing. Yet because the child is paralyzed, albeit momentarily, she also paralyzes her owner, who must seek help from Jesus. The child also interrupts the goings and the comings of the centurion soldiers, since the centurion is not with them to give them orders. Thus, your paralysis, the child also interrupts the imperial expansion. For about 8 short verses in a very long 28 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, the pais is free of the centurion. The colonized is free of her colonizer. Her God has answered her prayers. The jeepney is the best known symbol of resistance and decolonization for Filipinos. Now, because of the gospel, we have another symbol, the pais, who disrupts imperial progress, even if only briefly, in the Gospel of Matthew. The pais was alone in the Matthean narrative of imperial expansion. Those of us who have seen the pais fight and who are involved in the struggle in the name of today's Paides, like Rosario, are legion. To read the Bible inside the jeepney is to celebrate occupied and colonized people's capacity to beat swords into plowshares, to transform weapons of mass destruction into instruments of mass celebration, mortar shells and bullets into peace bells, pilgrim rifle barrels into Apache flutes, Israeli tear gas canisters into Palestinian flower pots, US Jeeps into Filipino jeepneys.
Salamat po, Revelacion Balunta. That was so enriching. I mean, who can imagine reading the Bible using jeepney hermeneutics? But you have just shown that to us. And you've also pointed out to us the imperializing message of Matthew. And yet we have this figure, the pais, who resists that imperialism and challenges us to also resist that imperialism. So thank you so much for giving us this form of hermeneutics. I now turn to Dr. Sison. Dr. Sison couldn't make it to this part of the presentation, but he will be here at the Q&A. So for now, we have his recording, and let me just introduce who he is. He is the Vatican II Chair of Theology and Professor of Systematic Theology at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. His latest book, The Art of Indigenous Enculturation, Grace on the Edge of Genius, was named one of the 12 most important theology books of the year by the Englewood Review of Books. You will find the rest of his bio in the chat box. Today, he will be speaking on Indigenous Enculturation, a hermeneutics of serendipity. And thank you now, Shimeng, for playing that video.
Winter greetings from Chicago. Indigenous Enculturation, a hermeneutics of serendipity. Normative geography will tell you that the Philippines is in the Far East. If language mirrors and shapes our perception of the world, then Far East endorses the asymmetric positioning that my birth country is exotic and not familiar, socioculturally backward and not progressive, very far indeed from the Euro-American spatial and geopolitical axis that determines the rest of the world's value. As many other academic disciplines, theology is not exempted from an intellectual cartography based on a favored center that is distinctly Western. What is clear, however, are the implications of such an underrepresentation on the side of those who have been overlooked. For those who remain far, remain invisible, and their faint, distant voices easily and routinely drown in the resounding Western chorus of the proximate. Precisely because theology is contextual and perspectival, the direction of the hermeneutical current has been, by default, from the center to the edge. I seek to contribute to the redirection of the flow of wisdom, theological hermeneutics from the edge to the center. Indigenous enculturation, indigenous taken in the sense of native to a local community, is a departure from what appears to have been the emphasis on enculturation as a strategy employed by professional foreign missionaries to evangelize various cultures. It represents a post-colonial retrieval of the term's vital meaning in view of the creative and heroic efforts of indigenous peoples who have, as artisans of their own histories and destinies, upheld their authentic cultural identity and the power of their own agency while seeking religious synthesis. Scholars have emphasized the mutual character of enculturation involving a two-way process: insertion of the gospel into a particular culture and introduction of the culture into the gospel. This mutual assimilation and enrichment was affirmed at the Vatican celebration of the 5th centenary of Christianity in the Philippines last March. Pope Francis proclaims, "You received the joy of the gospel, the good news that God so loved us, that he gave his son for us." To which the Philippines' Cardinal Tagle responds, "The fact that the Christian faith was received by the majority of our people who gave it a Filipino character is also a gift of God." Indeed, Filipino indigenous enculturation, an enculturation from within, is also a gift of God. In my work, I've chosen to use a trimodal approach that enables me to turn the prism in different ways to reveal a number of interpretive facets: a hermeneutics of suspicion, a hermeneutics of appreciation, and a new method I introduce, a hermeneutics of serendipity. It is this third methodological moment that I wish to draw attention to. A hermeneutics of serendipity sheds light on how unanticipated turns of history kindled ironic emancipatory currents that allowed for the flourishing of the indigenous culture's creative genius, notwithstanding colonial and post-colonial curtailment. Coined by the 18th century English political writer Horace Walpole from the word Serendip, the classical Persian name for Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. The term serendipity refers to the faculty of making fortunate discoveries by accident, and also the occurrence and instance of these discoveries. In 1754, he was describing a folk tale entitled The Three Princes of Serendip, where the king's son in the story made auspicious discoveries by accident and sagacity. As we know, serendipity has now gained wide currency as a descriptive term, from unexpected medical discoveries, scientific inventions, and even in popular culture. In the contextual and post-colonial frame of my work, it is purposeful to understand serendipity as a conspiracy of grace. The serendipitous turns of history open up chirological exodus moments for those who have been enslaved, humiliated, and defaced by what is not God. Against insurmountable odds, our ancestors were able to find unexpected creative spaces for themselves, where they were afforded the chance to regain a sense of authentic identity, dignity, and agency within the colonial crucible and its continuing after effect. Thus, grace can be found on the edge of genius, in those fragile turns where surprising mystery and audacious creativity kiss one another, so to speak. The desired outcome of the Spanish mission of the 16th century and onwards was to convert the Philippines to the true Catholic religion, and in the process, obliterate the primal religion of the indigenous population. Serendipitously for the Filipinos, the unexpected turns worked in their favor, making room for indigenous religion to commingle with Spanish Catholicism. Incrementally, these set the stage for the possibility of a religious double belonging and enculturation. Some of these serendipitous events include the following. First, the Spanish settlers expected to gain full governance and control of the colony as they did in Mexico and Peru. But the geography of the Philippines, consisting of more than 7,100 islands of mountains, rainforests, and coasts, extending to about 1,770 kilometers, made consolidated Spanish oversight and control of parishes and mission outposts exceedingly difficult, if not next to impossible. This offered creative spaces for Filipinos to interweave elements of indigenous worship with Catholic practices. Second point, in their push to preserve Spanish ecclesiastical dominance, the friars of the 18th and 19th century worked to bar indigenous Filipino clergy from leadership roles in the parish. Filipino priests were subjected to racial discrimination. They were judged to be immoral, disloyal, and intellectually inferior. As it happened, the lack of local pastors deprived the colonial mission of potential bridge figures in the work of catechetical and pastoral instruction, consequently weakening Spanish control. So it's the very opposite of the planned colonial objective. Third, and importantly, the religious fiesta, that lively and colorful celebration of Catholic seasons and feast days of patron saints, was the Spanish strategy to bait resistant Filipinos to resettle in the Cabecera complex, the centralized town capital designed to facilitate the exercise of colonial and ecclesiastical authority over the indigenous communities. What they had not anticipated was that the fiesta allowed for comunitas, a semi-autonomous zone that would liquefy the boundaries between what was perceived as a sacred, which was Iberian Catholicism, and what was perceived as profane, which was the Filipino indigenous religion. This became fertile ground for the flourishing of a Filipino brand of Catholicism that still very much exists today. The notion of serendipity shares resonances with the Tagalog bahala na, an expression signifying resignation of one's fortunes to fate. In its original rendering in ancient Baybayin script, the word bahala is identified with Bathala, the godhead of indigenous religion. In its fuller original sense as Bathalana, the expression means entrusting one's life prospects to God. Presuming its rootedness in the core value of kagandahang loob, the beauty of one's authentic inner self, Bathalana connotes that when you sincerely put your loob, or your heart and soul, into an endeavor, the grace of Bathala will cause the cosmic forces to align in your favor in ways you do not necessarily expect. From the Filipino cultural perspective, the unexpected turns in the Spanish colonial enterprise vis-a-vis the creative genius of the indigenous community were the conditions for Bathala's conspiracy of grace. As a case study, I look into Poong Jesus Nazareno, or the Black Nazarene, a dark-skinned, cross-bearing image of Jesus enshrined in Manila's Quiapo Church, the nerve center for Catholic piety in the Philippines. Brought by Spanish missionaries from Mexico in the 17th century via the Manila Galleon route, the icon has attracted throngs of devotees and pilgrims for centuries. The fervor surrounding the annual procession of the Black Nazarene is an astonishing religious visceral phenomenon, a pilgrimage of touch that has long eclipsed the original colonial choreography of controlled solemn observance and formality that characterize its original Iberian moorings. You can appreciate the difference between an 1847 artwork commissioned by the Spanish colonial government and a painting from the National Museum of the Philippines a century later. I worked on the thesis that the shadow referent of this impassioned devotion is a pre-colonial Filipino indigenous religious practice that serendipitously survived nearly 4 centuries of Spanish colonial Christianization, and this could be seen in a comparative semiotic examination of depictions of the Black Nazarene devotion in colonial and post-colonial paintings and artwork. On January 9, 2019, I had the chance to participate in the overnight vigil leading to the Traslación. That's the main procession of the Black Nazarene. Standing before barefooted pilgrims, young and old, majority of them bearing the heavy cross of poverty and afflicted with all kinds of illnesses, was a humbling experience that brought tears to my eyes. This was a gathering of the crucified peoples who came here seeking a little more love, a little more clemency, a little more compassion, because they could no longer subsist on the scraps that fall from Jesus' table. Mauwi sa amin ang kaharian mo. May your kingdom come home to us. That is the hope and the mission. Like a typhoon of religious fervor, the sea of pilgrims began the 20-hour procession of the Black Nazarene to Quiapo Church, where it is emplaced. In this liminal interlude, the devotees claim Jesus as their own. The cross-bearing Nazarene is no longer the imported Spanish icon, elevated on a marble altar in a state of inertia. He becomes the people's Poong Jesus Nazareno, the enculturated savior figure who can be touched and felt by the Filipino community of faith. In our celebration of the 5th centenary of Christianity in the Philippines, a hermeneutics of serendipity opens a portal for us to see that for centuries, our ancestors had found grace, on the edge of genius in an indigenous enculturation with Christianity. To echo Cardinal Tagle, the fact that the Christian faith was received by the majority of our people who gave it a Filipino character is a gift of God.
Thank you so much to Dr. Sison for giving us his wonderful talk, which outlines his own hermeneutics of serendipity, which helps us to see that that actually grace does work on the edge of genius, and works with the people rather than against the people. So just to sum up the talks for today, as you can see, the themes have been about how the Indigenous peoples remain as very much a part of what it means to be Filipino, and that Indigenous sense is something that we continue to work on and hope to recover. And we've seen that with Dr. Strobel's work, as she showed us, that deletion of Indigenous ways actually creates some sort of a spiritual illness, a psychological illness amongst Filipinos, and recovering that Indigenous sense actually is a way of decolonizing. And Dr. Ano also showed us the effects of wiping out the Indigenous ways, and that has ecological effects that now we must turn to, and that even the Pope himself has said that we need to do that in the Synod on the Amazon and in Laudato Si, because the wisdom of the Indigenous peoples, which was disregarded before, should now be something that we must turn to if we wish to save our planet and each other. And Dr. Valunta showed us a way of looking at the Bible as distinctively a Filipino, from a place of a Filipina, from a place where it was seen as a tool of evil, but was reappropriated for a tool of good, the jeepney. And so thank you to all our speakers for today. And now we turn to the Q&A section, where we will where we will answer your questions that you've posted. And please continue to post your questions as we answer them. So we turn to this first question. Dr. Wilson, Wilson Temporal says, how can we properly address the nuances of shared accountabilities by local structures of oppression and the caveats of appropriations and false claims and impositions of Indigenous identities and views? He hasn't actually addressed that to anybody, so any of the panelists can potentially answer this question.
Well, I really don't understand the question. So if somebody can rephrase it, what specifically he's referring to.
Yeah. Maybe we can break down the question. The question says, how can we properly address the nuances of shared accountabilities? So even that, being accountable to, I'm guessing accountable to local structures of oppression. Maybe if we just answer that particular one. Also, we could turn to the next question, and Wilson Temporal, if you would like to clarify a question, that will be really good too. So I'll move on. Oh, Dr. Ano, you might wish to answer. Oh, sorry, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Yeah, it's the second part of the question that I'm really interested on.
Yeah.
It's like, because, indigenous theologies have their own internal correctives. And this is, in fact, the advantage of a religion without a book. I mean, I saw Dr. Levi Bautista talking about it. The advantage of a religion without a book in favor of a more practical quest for balance within indigenous theologizing. Yeah, that's just my thoughts on the second part of the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ano. Did anyone else wish to answer that question? If not, and Wilson, if you're still there, please clarify your question because Dr. Strobel would love to answer it. Otherwise, we go on to Joseph Albert Reyes. He says, how does faith purify culture and how does culture enrich faith? And so again, he hasn't addressed that to anyone in particular. So any of the panelists can answer this question. It's a very loaded question. There's so much in that.
I always have a problem with the dichotomy, you know, that faith and that faith purifies culture and culture enriches faith. I think from a holistic indigenous perspective, the faith is part of the culture, and there's no kind of purification enriching process that is necessary because it is integral, you know. But I know that if for those of us conditioned to think in dualisms, it might present some bifurcation. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Dr.
Or
Strobel.
maybe it's the thing that the faith is like associated with, I mean, Christianization, and the other one is talking about what is indigenous to us. Because from my end, I will talk about, and that's why I'm talking about, like, I'm using the line uprooting the cross in favor of the udong, simply because I wish us to like give the Judeo-Christian scriptures a second look, or a third look, or a fourth look, using the indigenous lens, so that we can reaffirm actually the earth-friendly myth of the Judeo-Christian scripture. We can rediscover even the fundamentals of our faith when we engage indigenous faith traditions. And I think so we can, it's like a dialectic or a cycle. And well, Dr. Season is talking about serendipity, right? So I think it's within that kind of a discovery, mutual.
Wonderful. I might turn to Dr. Sison then to give us a little bit more on how we might answer this question. How does faith purify culture and how does culture enrich faith? Welcome, Dr. Sison, by the way.
Thank you, I made it. Well, I'd rather talk about the idea of mutual enrichment rather than a purification necessarily and a contribution on the other end, because in enculturation, we're looking for dynamic equivalence. What is there in the culture that echoes in the gospel and vice versa? It's the vice versa that's a problem, because in Christian theology, it's always been one way. The missionaries are out to purify the culture, and most of the time, there's no reciprocity. The contribution of the culture is overlooked or muted to such an extent that the local culture is silenced and rendered, distant and far and marginal. And that's the issue here that we're trying to bring forward, that the culture itself has a contribution to gospel faith. Surprise, surprise. The culture has within itself treasures to offer. And I'll name just one. Cultures sort of cues theology, Christian theology, to think in context. There's no such thing as an abstract truth. That truth should be verified, validated on the ground. And what better way to do that than to look into the indigenous culture? I think it's a contradiction if the local culture and its contributions are diminished when the gospel is introduced. So again, it's that back and forth, it's that dialogical dynamic equivalence that is a linchpin in understanding the mutuality between these two cultures, should I say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sison. It just reminds me of Vatican II that actually pointed out that we have to affirm what is good in all cultures rather than seeking to sort of purify them and thinking that Christianity has all the answers. So we turn now to the question by Lily Mendoza. She says, if we seek to recover the indigenous roots of Christianity and thus also Judaism, as Professor Strobel and Arno suggest, doesn't that mean it should be understood as just one eco-generated spirituality among many others all across the world, relevant primarily to that particular watershed? And if so, isn't mission just imperialism by another name? Oh, actually, it's by Jim Perkinson, who is the husband of Dr. Lily Mendoza, who is, by the way, Dr. Strobel's sister. So yeah, welcome to your family, Dr. Strobel. So I think that question, I guess, Dr. Arno, you're the first person, and then Dr. Strobel.
Well, as suggested by ecology, it's like the local is global, right? So local religion, local theology are contributory to the building of the faith. And that mission can actually mean, like what Dr. Season was saying, celebrating the truth in its culture, right? Going back to St. Justin, for example, these the seeds of wisdom, I mean, these seeds of truth that you can find. It's a matter of celebrating them and affirming them, and really taking them into the truth of, well, the truth of the Christian faith.
Thank you, Dr. Arno. I think I also want to turn to Dr. Volunta, because you talked about imperialism and resisting that through the reading of the Bible in the jeepney. Would you say, is mission just imperialism by another name?
Yes. Can I answer Jim's question? I like his work, particularly his work on the shamans. As far as he has a wonderful essay on Matthew, especially the centurion as well. So I think what he's raising is very, very important, and Dr. Ano raised this already, because part of our, how do I say this? That's why we need an exorcism, because we have been colonized and socialized to think of the Bible as like one homogenic text. It's not. It's a library. The fact that it's a library is already a formation of difference and plurality. Like what Dr. Ano was saying, if you read the Bible and pray every day, you will grow in the knowledge that there's no such animal as monotheism in the text. Monotheism is a European colonial project, and like I just give a quick example. We always translate, for example, Israel as wrestling with God, but that's not translation of Israel. The translation of Israel is wrestling with El. Another example is when we say Elijah, my God is Yahweh. No. Elijah is not my God is Yahweh. El is Yahweh. So you can see already the conflation of the different tribes, trying to force one reading when you have a text, an ancient Palestinian library, which was not written for us, being co-opted as a weapon to subjugate peoples, cultures, spiritualities, and faiths.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Volunta. I think, Dr. Strobel, you wanted to answer that?
I just want to commend to everyone the work of James Perkinson, because he has been doing a lot of writing on how to read the Bible through an indigenous lens and the indigenous roots of Christianity, and discussion of, isn't mission just imperialism by another name? If we do not learn to read the Christian text or the scriptures through that indigenous perspective, as this religion coming out of a particular place and particular time in a particular people, then you will be losing the ability to read the scriptures from that eco-generated spirituality of your own. Yeah. And this is actually related to the next question of Levi Bautista. So you might want to connect.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Dr. Strobel. Yeah, in fact, we are on this matter of religious texts, so we will we'll get you back, Dr. Volunta. I know Levi Bautista said this is for Dr. Strobel and Arno, but I think this is also a question for you, Dr. Volunta, which is, he says, in yesterday's session, Father Albert Alejo raised the matter about the lack of religious texts of indigenous peoples, and therefore Western epistemology and discourse have marginalized indigenous knowledge, which is portrayed as oral. Dr. Mendoza Strobel and Dr. Arno's presentation belie the absence of interrogable indigenous knowledges. Their own work testifies to the flourishing of indigenous epistemology. Interrogable knowledge is knowledge that is about being, knowing, and doing. Indigenous knowledge is plentiful of such interrogable knowledge. It seems to me that the starting point of dialogue with indigenous peoples is not the Western assertion of lack of written sacred texts, but rather the fixation by dominant Western discourse that indigenous epistemology must be based on written texts. That fixation is in keeping with Western colonializing enterprise, which are hegemonic and homogenizing. So yeah, I might get a few people to answer this. And we also have Father Albert Alejo, who's here too, who can answer for himself. So first of all, I might turn to Dr. Volunta, seeing as religious text is your area.
Just a quick response. Until the invention of the printing press, this text that a lot of people worship like it's an idol was basically experienced by so many people, by generations, millennia of people, as oral and performance. And the text itself was written to be heard. That's why to this day, we still have the 3-year cycle of lection. Most people don't read the Bible, including Bible professors. But most people hear the Bible, experience the Bible, so thank you.
That's a wonderful answer, Dr. Volunta. Dr. Arno, would you like to give your own answer?
Yeah, I mean, my Northeast Asian theologians, and they have their so-called tribal theology, and they have their way of rationalizing what tribal means in that phraseology, argues on the legitimacy of the land as the starting point of anything textual. So in indigenous theology, space is the wellspring of everything, theology and ethics. Even this discourse on justice and peace starts from the spatial. So basically, that's the affirmation not only of the tribal theologians of Northeast India, but also some Aboriginal theologians, which I read from some of the literature coming from that region. The importance of land as the starting point of anything textual. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I don't know if Dr. Sison or Dr. Strobel wanted to give their own answers. Dr. Sison first.
Yes, I think when we're talking about indigenous cultures, we must come to terms with how they express truths within the matrix of their culture. At least in my experience and in my work, I try to look at theology and theological sources from an aesthetics of liberation, which is really looking into semiotic moments in theology, where we look at art and rituals and performative expressions of faith that come from the ground up, and consider that as text, not simply codified written text. And I think the expansion of the hermeneutical sources that we have also expands our imagination as to what theology is and what religion is, in a way that speaks truth and meaning to the indigenous cultures in question.
Great, thank you, Doctor. Dr. Strobel, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to what you'd said previously.
Well, I think when I said colonialism begins with the land, it's all about the land. And so what does it mean for the land to be the source of our theological reflection, And in the United States, there is the land back movement, you know, because people are beginning, Christians, especially Christians, I think, are trying to make history right again, you know, to correct the wrongs of the past. And there are churches that are trying to still to repeal the doctrine of discovery because it has never been repealed. So those kinds of looking at indigenous knowledge systems and practices, especially when they say learn how to live with the land and not just on the land, you know, that in itself is a source of a lot of learning and unlearning that all of us civilized folks have to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I think about Laudato Si, where Pope Francis addresses the land as our mother and our sister. And if we can imagine the land as our mother and sister, we might imagine and treat her differently. I'm moving on to the next question by an anonymous attendee. They say kapwa and pakikipagkapwa are very prominent in the celebration of the Eucharist. Unfortunately, because of Western influence on our theology, we tend to focus on the work of Christ for his people, vertical, and ignores it, the Eucharist, the ethical/horizontal aspect. Do you have any suggestion on the process of liturgical enculturation? I might turn to you, Reverend Arno, because you talk about the liturgia of the commune.
Yeah, I'm talking about, like Dr. Season was talking about, this dynamic equivalence, right? And we have this other narrative coming from indigenous communities. In fact, I would talk more about correspondence of at least these two narratives, the narrative of Christianity and the narrative of indigenous peoples, as articulated and expressed, embodied, for example, in these rituals of Sinpangili, this unity ritual, Sinpangili, the feasting, like the Bagnas, or the rite of Thanksgiving, or even the Kanyao for the Cordillerans, where you can see even these elements that are basic to the Eucharist, you can see them in among the Igrots, and you can see the importance of the building of the community. So if you're talking about Eucharist as building the body of God, you can see it concretely expressed in these rituals. And the good thing there is that it is not simply just a gathering of human beings. It's a gathering of every creature coming together. Even the unseen are part of that community. So I think that's the thing that we can learn, especially when we're talking about this ecological or this climate emergency situation. I think that's the one that can respond and that can call us to go back to the what is essentially Eucharistic in our scriptural and even tradition as Christians.
Yeah, that wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, you're so right. I might turn to the next question. Unless, yeah. So Quanta Zambales says she mentions her ancestral place where she's settling at, and it's a question for anyone. I often think about how the West took God out of nature and put them into a building. Very interesting. Since I have you on my screen, Reverend Arno, would you like to answer first?
Come again? Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
Please?
She says, I often think about how the West took God out of nature and put them into a building. I think this is perfect for you, seeing as you talked about taking the sacredness out of the pudong.
Well, that's part of our civilizational, work. Sometimes we, part of our setting a space for the holy. I mean, it comes natural to us, especially if we are like Masons and with the architectural engineering sense, then we put up these things for anything that we call sacred. But but the problem with that is that when we were able to put up these structures, we forgot that actually we're suffused. Every space is suffused with divinity. And so then we start trying to dichotomize between what is holy and what is profane space. And that's the genesis of our problem. So we forgot to actually, the story of our faith, especially when we talk about the garden as the epitome as the social vision of our faith. It's the Garden of Eden, right? And then we put up a temple. So it's the temple versus the garden. So it's good to look at it from that perspective.
Wonderful. That's
And
great.
so many prophets were very critical of the temple. In
Mm.
fact, even the prophet Ezekiel was talking about, well, we can worship correctly not only in the temple, but I mean that this was the situation when they were in exile. And so, especially during this time of pandemic, when we feel like uprooted and being thrown into some kind of an infected, literally infected kind of living, I think this is where we can affirm our hope that God is with us in wherever we are, in whatever situation.
Wonderful. That's great. It just reminds me of Lumen Gentium in Vatican II, where the second chapter, it was the church is first and foremost, after, we recognize it as sacred, but also it is the people of God first and foremost, and not just the building or not just Jerusalem or not, it's many images. And yes, we need to reconsider it as in nature as well. Now I turn to the question from another anonymous attendee, which is, what is it in the Filipino psyche that has made Christianity last as long as it has in the Philippines and allowed Christianity to be the dominant religion in the country? Is this same quality/trait responsible for not accepting other religions as much as Christianity in the country? I might turn to Dr. Strobel on about that question.
I don't know if I agree with the premise, because I think the Christianity that we know in the Philippines is like the surface layer of the form, and Melba Magay, this Filipino theologian that I quoted before, said that we were not really converted. We merely exchanged forms. We exchanged our anitos for the image of the Santo Niño and the Virgin Mary and so on. So I think part of that indigenous spirituality that continues to subvert and continues to negotiate with the Christian form is our willingness and capacity for inclusiveness. Kapwa is inclusive in that way, so, but the other side of that, when you look at it, of Christianity as part of the missionary project, civilizing project, and when Vince Raphael talks about white love, the Filipinos fell in love with the colonizers, basically. So they were, that's why we're kind of belated in this decolonization movement, because, it just takes that long.
Talking about Vicente Rafael, I think he talks also about these three realms, right? The first realm, where you can find the convento, the plaza, the municipio. I'm geographical in the geographical sense. And then you have this second realm, and then the third realm. And the third realm, I think, is where we can locate what Lenny is saying. This is the realm of resistance. And at the same means they're still trying to do this exchange with Christianity, but at the same time trying to maintain their indigeneity. And at the same time, when we talk about indigeneity, it's also the concern for their own political independence from the colonizers. So you can see this as some kind of a resistance zone. So they try to maintain that their placement in this third realm. Maybe we can locate ourselves in the second realm. Academics may find themselves there. And then you can see, those who are very much part of the establishment. So I think it would be good also to, using Rafael, that particular piece on Tagalog, geography of resistance in Vicente Rafael's.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Sison, did you want to comment on the Filipino psyche that has made Christianity last this long and so forth?
Sure. I don't think there's a simple answer to that very complex question, but one thing I can contribute to the discussion is that, well, I'm going to go back to serendipity. I think the reason why there was not an outright rejection of Christianity is because there were interstices in history where the flourishing of the indigenous identity and the power of their agency became possible. And because of this, you have on one level official religion, and on another level, you have a lived faith of the people. And professional theologians tend to dismiss folk religiosity, but actually, that is the rich, fertile ground by which true identity germinates and flourishes. And so, yeah, that's one piece. There are many other answers to this question, but that's the contribution I have.
Thank you so much. I'm going to leave the last comment/question to Dr. Volunta, and this is from Carmelo Sarita. She says, sacred texts take different forms, not just written, just like there is the oral Torah, and then there is embodied text in sacred rituals. So we must look for indigenous sacred texts in other forms, such as rituals that build community life with the kapwa and all creation. I think that's more a comment than anything, but I don't know if you wanted to comment some more on that.
I totally agree. My favorite word, of course, because I teach the Bible, is semeia. And semeia is basically sign. And signs are polyvalent. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And so this concludes our Q&A section and a wonderful 2 hours of enriching input and discussion. And the end of our 2-day webinar. You know, I'm so grateful to so many people who made this happen and work, especially to the co-sponsors of this event who advertise it amongst their networks, particularly Georgetown University, De La Salle University, BBI, the Ecclesiological Investigations Network, Dakateo, Lord Waston Webinar Series, Religious Educators Association of the Philippines, San Carlos Major Seminary, Pacific School of Religion, and the Graduate Theological Union of Berkeley, USA, University of San Francisco, California, Union Theological Seminary, the Philippine X and Philippine Studies Working Group at Berkeley. We really request if you could just please fill in the evaluation form, especially for those who want to receive a certificate of participation. Please fill in that evaluation form by scanning the QR code or going to the link that's in your chat. Thank you, Willard, for putting that in. A special thank you to the Religious Educators Association of the Philippines for taking care of the evaluation and certificates. Thank you too to Professor Lefebvre, Professor Brazal, Bruce Gopin, Shimeng, Willard, Makaran, and your institutions for making this event possible, with a special mention to DLSU DTRE for the internalization team for all the hard work behind the scenes that you've been doing to make this happen. Thank you again to the speakers for the work that you do and for being willing to speak at this event. If for those of you who have attended and you've been enriched by the talks, just hold on tight. The speakers today are going to expand their talks, and Professor Brazal and I will be putting it together in an anthology. So just wait for that. That will be published through Ecclesiological Investigations Palgrave Macmillan series. So again, finally, thank you to you, the audience, for attending our event and doing the hard work of continuing Filipino traditions and decolonization and working towards the common good so that, we live in a better world, we build God's reign on earth. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in a future event.